Why Buddhism isn't just a religion, it's a radical experiment. The Buddha never placed unconditional demands on anyone's faith. For people from a culture where the dominant religions do make such demands, this is one of Buddhism's most attractive features. It's especially appealing to those who, in reaction to the demands of organized religion, embrace the view of scientific empiricism that nothing deserves our trust unless it can be measured against physical data. In this light, the Buddha's famous instructions to the Kalamas are often read as an invitation to believe or not whatever we like. Don't go by reports, by legends, by traditions, by scripture, by logical conjecture, by inference, by analogies, by agreement through pondering views, by probability, or by the thought, this contemplative is our teacher. When you know for yourselves that these mental qualities are skillful, these mental qualities are blameless, these mental qualities are praised by the wise, these mental qualities, when adopted and carried out, lead to welfare and to happiness, then you should enter and remain in them. And 3:66. Pointing to this passage, many modern writers have gone so far as to say that faith has no place in the Buddhist tradition, that the proper Buddhist attitude is one of skepticism. But even though the Buddha recommends tolerance and a healthy skepticism toward matters of faith, he also notes a conditional imperative. If you sincerely want to put an end to suffering, that's the condition, you should take certain things on faith as working hypotheses and then test them through following his path of practice. The advice to the Kalamas, in fact, contains the crucial caveat that you must take into account what wise people value. This caveat gives balance to the Buddha's advice. Just as you shouldn't give unreserved trust to outside authority, you can't give unreserved trust to your own logic and feelings if they go against experience and the genuine wisdom of others. As other early discourses make clear, wise people can be recognized by their words and behavior as measured against standards set by the Buddha and his awakened disciples. The proper attitude toward those who meet these standards is faith. For a disciple who has conviction in the teacher's message and lives to penetrate it, what accords with the Dhamma is this: the Blessed One is the teacher. I am a disciple. He is the one who knows, not I. Men 70. Faith in awakening. Repeatedly, the Buddha stated that faith in a teacher is what leads you to learn from that teacher. Faith in the Buddha's own awakening is a requisite strength for anyone else who wants to attain awakening, as it fosters persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. This faith can take you all the way to the deathless. So there's a tension in the Buddha's recommendations about faith and empiricism. Few of Asian Buddhists I know find the tension uncomfortable, but Western Buddhists, raised in a culture where religion and faith have long been at war with science and empiricism, find it very disconcerting. In my discussions with them, they often try to resolve it in the same ways that, historically, the tension between Christian faith and scientific empiricism has been resolved in our own culture. Three general positions stand out because they are at the same time so common and so clearly Western. Consciously or not, they attempt to understand the Buddha's position on faith and empiricism in a way that can be easily mapped onto the modern Western battle lines between religion and science. The first interpretation has its roots in the side of Western culture that totally rejects the legitimacy of faith. In this view, the Buddha embodies the Victorian ideal of the heroic agnostic, one who eschewed the childish consolations of faith in favor of a purely scientific method for strengthening one's own mind. Because his method focused entirely on the present moment, questions of past and future were totally irrelevant to his message. Thus, any references to faith in such issues as past karma, future rebirth, or an unconditioned happiness separate from the senses are later interpolations in the texts, which Buddhist agnostics, following the Buddha's example, should do their best to reject. The second interpretation has roots in the side of Western culture that has rejected either the specifics of Christian faith or the authority of any organized religion, but has appreciated faith as an essential requirement for mental health. This view presents the Buddha as a hero from the Romantic era, appreciating the subjective value of faith in establishing a sense of wholeness within and interconnectedness without, regardless of what the object of that faith might be. In other words, it doesn't matter where faith is directed, as long as it's deeply felt and personally nourishing. Faith in the Buddha's awakening, in this view, means simply believing that he found what worked for himself, which carries no implications for what will work for you. If you find the teaching on karma and rebirth comforting, fine, believe it. If not, don't. What's important is that you relate to your faith in a way that's emotionally healing, nourishing, and empowering. A third interpretation encompasses the first two, but instead of presenting the Buddha as a hero, depicts him as a victim trapped in his historical situation. Much like us, he was faced with finding a meaningful life in light of the worldview of his day. His views on karma and rebirth were simply assumptions picked up from the primitive science of ancient India, while his path of practice was an attempt to negotiate a satisfying life within those assumptions. If he were alive today, he would try to reconcile his values with the discoveries of modern science, in the same way that some Westerners have done with their faith in monotheism. The underlying assumption of this position is that science is concerned with facts, religion with values. Science provides the hard data to which religion should provide meaning. Thus, each Buddhist would be performing the work of a Buddha by accepting the hard facts that have been scientifically proven for our generation, and then searching the Buddhist tradition, as well as other traditions, where appropriate, for myths and values to give meaning to those facts, and in the process forging a new Buddhism for our times. Each of these three interpretations may make eminent sense from a Western point of view, but none of them do justice to what we know of the Buddha or of his teaching on the role of faith and empiricism on the path. All three are correct in emphasizing the Buddha's unwillingness to force his teachings on other people, but by forcing our own assumptions onto his teachings and actions, they misread what that unwillingness means. He wasn't an agnostic. He had strong reasons for declaring some ideas as worthy of faith and others as not. And his teachings on karma, rebirth, and nirvana broke radically with the dominant worldview of his time. He was neither a Victorian nor a romantic hero, nor was he a victim of circumstances. He was a hero who, among other things, mastered the issue of faith and empiricism in a radical way. But to appreciate that way, we first have to step back from the Western cultural battlefield and look at faith and empiricism in a more basic context, simply as processes within the individual mind. Although we like to think that we base our decisions on hard facts, we actually use both faith and empiricism in every decision we make. Even in our most empirically based decisions, our vision is hampered by our position in time. As Kierkegaard noted, we live forwards but understand backwards. Any hard-headed business entrepreneur will tell you that the future has to be taken on faith, no matter how much we know of the past. What's more, we're often forced into momentous decisions where there's no time or opportunity to gather enough past facts for an informed choice. At other times, we have too many facts, as when a doctor is faced with many conflicting tests on a patient's condition, and we have to go on faith in deciding which facts to focus on and which ones to ignore. However, faith also plays a deeper role in many of our decisions. As William James once observed, there are two kinds of truths in life: those whose validity has nothing to do with our actions, and those whose reality depends on what we do. Truths of the first sort, truths of the observer, include facts about the behavior of the physical world, how atoms form molecules, how stars explode. Truths of the second sort, truths of the will, include skills, relationships, business ventures, anything that requires your effort to make it real. With truths of the observer, it's best to stay skeptical until reasonable evidence is in. With truths of the will, though, the truth won't happen without your faith in it, often in the face of unpromising odds. For example, if you don't believe that becoming a pianist is worthwhile or that you have the makings of a good pianist, it won't happen. Truths of the will are the ones most relevant to our pursuit of true happiness. Many of the most inspiring stories in life are of people who create truths of this sort when a mountain of empirical evidence, racism, poverty, physical disability, is against them. In cases like this, the truth requires that faith actively discount the immediate facts. If we dig even deeper into the psychology of decision-making, we run into an area for which no scientific evidence can offer proof. Do we actually act, or are actions an illusion? Are our acts already predetermined by physical laws or an external intelligence, or do we have free will? Are causal relationships real or only a fiction? Even the most carefully planned scientific experiment could never settle any of these issues, and yet once we become aware of them, we have to take a stand on them if we want to put energy into our thoughts, words, and deeds. These were the areas where the Buddha focused his teachings on empiricism and faith. Although the first noble truth requires that we observe suffering until we comprehend it, we have to take on faith his assertion that the facts we observe about suffering are the most important guide for making decisions, moment by moment, throughout life. Because the third noble truth, the cessation of suffering, is a truth of the will, we have to take it on faith that it's a worthwhile and attainable goal. And because the fourth noble truth, the path to the cessation of suffering, is a path of action and skill, we have to take it on faith that our actions are real, that we have free will, and yet that there's a causal pattern to the workings of the mind from which we can learn in mastering that skill. As the Buddha said, the path will lead to a direct experience of these truths, but only if you bring faith to the practice will you know this for yourself. In other words, faith in the Buddhist context means faith in the ability of your actions to lead to a direct experience of the end of suffering. The Buddha offered these teachings to people seeking advice on how to find true happiness. That's why he was able to avoid any coercion of others. His teachings assumed that his listeners were already involved in a search. When we understand his views on what it means to search, why people search and what they're searching for, we can understand his advice on how to use faith and empiricism in a successful search. The best way to do this is to examine 5 of his similes, illustrating how a search should be conducted. The first simile illustrates search in its most raw and unfocused form. 2 strong men have grabbed another man by the arms and are dragging him to a pit of burning embers. The Buddha notes, "Wouldn't the man twist his body this way and that?" The twisting of his body stands for the way we react to suffering. We don't bother to ask if our suffering is predetermined or our actions have any hope of success. We simply put up a struggle and do what we can to escape. It's our natural reaction. The Buddha taught that this reaction is twofold. We're bewildered. Why is this happening to me? And we search for a way to put an end to the suffering. When he stated that he taught nothing but suffering and the end of suffering, he was responding to these 2 reactions, providing an explanation of suffering and its end so as to do away with our bewilderment, at the same time showing the way to the end of suffering so as to satisfy our search. He had no use for the idea that our suffering comes from our struggle to resist suffering, that the search for an end to suffering is precisely what keeps us from seeing the peace already there. In light of the above simile, simply relaxing into a total acceptance of the moment means relaxing into the prospect of being burned alive. The second simile. A man searching for fruit climbs up into a tree to eat his fill and to stuff his garments with fruit to take home. While he is there, another man searching for fruit comes along. The second man can't climb the tree, but he has an axe, so he chops the tree down. If the first man doesn't quickly get out of the tree, he may break an arm or a leg or even die. This simile shows the perils of looking for true happiness in the wrong place. Sensual pleasures. If your happiness depends on anything other people can take away from you, you're putting yourself in danger. As the Buddha notes, we hope for happiness in sensual pleasures not because they've ever really satisfied us, but because we can't imagine any other escape from pain and suffering. If we allowed ourselves to believe that there is another alternative, we'd be more willing to question our strong faith in our cravings and attachments, more willing to look for that alternative and give it a try. And as the third simile argues, if we look in the right way, we'll find it. A person searching for milk tries to get milk out of a cow by twisting its horn. Another person searching for milk tries to get milk out of the cow by pulling at its udder. This simile is a response to the assertion that no human action can bring release from suffering. We can attain release, the Buddha said, as long as we follow the right method, like the person pulling at the udder of the cow. The right method starts with right understanding, and this is where faith in the Buddha's awakening comes in. As the Buddha once stated, he didn't tell us everything he awakened to. What he told was like a handful of leaves. What he learned was like all the leaves in the forest. Still, the leaves in the handful contained all the lessons that would help others to awaken. Right understanding begins with learning what those specific lessons are. The most important lesson and the most important item of faith is simply the fact of the awakening itself. The Buddha achieved it through his own efforts, and he did so, not because he was more than human, but because he developed mental qualities we all have the potential to develop. To have faith in his awakening thus means having faith in your own potential for awakening. However, the specifics of what he learned in his awakening are important as well. It's not simply the case that he found what worked for him, while what works for you may be something else entirely. No matter how much you twist a cow's horn, it'll never produce milk. The Buddha's insights penetrated into how things work, what it means for them to work. These insights apply to everyone throughout time. When summarizing his awakening in the most condensed form, the Buddha focused on a principle of causality that explains how we live in a world where patterns of causality fashion events, and yet those events are not totally predetermined by the past. The principle is actually a dual one, for there are two kinds of causality interweaving in our lives. The first is that of a cause giving results in the immediate present. When this is, that is. When this isn't, that isn't. When you turn on a stereo, for example, the noise comes out. When you turn it off, the noise stops. The second type of causality is that of a cause giving results over time. From the arising of this comes the arising of that. From the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. If you study now, you'll have knowledge long into the future. If you damage your brain, the negative effects will be long-term as well. Applied to karma, or intentional action, the dual principle means this. Any moment of experience consists of three things. 1. Pleasures and pains resulting from past intentions. 2. Present intentions. And 3. Pleasures and pains immediately resulting from present intentions. Thus, the present is not totally shaped by the past. In fact, the most important element shaping your present experience of pleasure or pain is how you fashion, with your present intentions, the raw material provided by past intentions, and your present intentions can be totally free. This is how there is free will in the midst of causality. At the same time, the pattern in the way intentions lead to results allows us to learn from past mistakes. This freedom within a pattern opens the way to a path of mental training, mastered through experience, that can lead to the end of suffering. We practice generosity, virtue, and meditation to learn the power of our intentions, and in particular to see what happens as our intentions grow more skillful. To fully test the power of intention, we work at making them so skillful that present intentions actually stop. Only when they stop can you prove for yourself how powerful they've been. And where they stop is where the unconditioned, the end of suffering, is found. From there, you can return to intentions, but you're no longer their captive or slave. In presenting his teachings on karma and suffering, the Buddha offered empirical evidence to corroborate them, noting, for instance, how your reaction to another person's misery depends on how attached you are to that person. But he never attempted a full-scale empirical proof. In fact, he heaped ridicule on his contemporaries, the Jains, who tried to prove their more deterministic teaching on karma by claiming that all those who kill, steal, lie, or engage in illicit sex will suffer from their actions here and now. Haven't you seen the case, the Buddha asked, where a man is rewarded by a king for killing the king's enemy, for stealing from the king's enemy, for amusing the king with a clever lie? Even though the basic principle of karma is simple enough, skillful intentions lead to pleasure, unskillful intentions to pain. The dual principle of causality through which karma operates is so complex, like a Mandelbrot set, that you would go crazy trying to nail the whole thing down empirically. So instead of an empirical proof for his teaching on karma, the Buddha offered a pragmatic proof. If you sincerely believe in his teachings on causality, karma, rebirth, and the Four Noble Truths, how will you act? What kind of life will you lead? Won't you tend to be more responsible and compassionate? If, on the other hand, you were to believe in any of the alternatives, such as a doctrine of an impersonal fate or a deity who determined the course of your pleasure and pain, or a doctrine that all things were coincidental and without cause, what would those beliefs logically lead you to do? If you acted consistently in line with them, would they allow you to put an end to suffering through your own efforts? Would they allow any purpose for effort at all? If, on the other hand, you refuse to commit to a coherent idea of what human action can do, would you be likely to pursue a demanding path of practice all the way through to the end? This was the kind of reasoning that the Buddha used to inspire faith in his awakening and in its relevance to our own search for true happiness. The fourth simile stresses the importance of not settling for anything less than the genuine thing. A man searching for heartwood goes into a forest and comes to a tree containing heartwood, but instead of taking the heartwood, he takes home some sapwood, branches, or bark. Faith in the possibility of nirvana, the heartwood of the path, is what keeps you from getting waylaid by the pleasures of the sapwood and bark. The gratification that comes from being generous and virtuous, the sense of peace, interconnectedness, and oneness that comes with strong concentration. Yet, nirvana isn't connected to anything we've ever experienced. It's already there, but hidden by all our desires for physical and mental activity. To touch it, we have to abandon our habitual attachment to activity. To believe that such a thing is possible and that it's the ultimate happiness is to take a major leap. Many in the Buddha's time, many were willing to take the leap, while many others were not, preferring to content themselves with the branches and sapwood, wanting simply to learn how to live happily with their families in this life and go to heaven in the next. Nirvana, they said, could wait. Faced with this honest and gentle resistance to his teaching on nirvana, the Buddha was happy to comply. But he was less tolerant of the stronger resistance he received from Brahmas, heavenly deities who complacently felt that their experience of limitless oneness and compassion in the midst of samsara, their sapwood, was superior to the heartwood of nirvana. In their case, he used all the psychic and intellectual powers at his disposal to humble their pride, for he realized that their views totally closed the door to awakening. If you see your sapwood as heartwood, you won't look for anything better. When your sapwood breaks, you'll decide that heartwood is a lie. But if you realize you're using bark and sapwood, you leave open the possibility that someday you'll go back and give the heartwood a try. Of course, it's even better if you can take the Buddha's teachings on nirvana as a direct challenge in this lifetime, as if he were saying, "Here's your chance. Can you prove me wrong?" The fifth simile. An experienced elephant hunter searching for a big bull elephant comes across a large elephant footprint in the forest. However, he doesn't jump to the conclusion that it's the footprint of a big bull elephant. Why? Because there are dwarf female elephants with big feet. It might be one of theirs. He follows along and sees some scratch marks and tusk marks high up on the trees, but still doesn't jump to the conclusion that he's on the trail of a big bull elephant. Why? Because there are tall female elephants with tusks. The marks might be theirs. He follows along and finally sees a big bull elephant under a tree or in a clearing. That's when he concludes that he's found his bull elephant. In explaining this simile, the Buddha identified all the preliminary steps of the practice, going into the wilderness as a monastic, adhering to the precepts, developing restraint, contentment, and strong concentration, seeing past lives and gaining vision of the beings of the cosmos dying and being reborn in line with their karma, as simply footprints and scratch marks of the Buddha's awakening. Only when you have your own first taste of awakening, having followed his path, do you really know that your faith in his awakening was well placed. Touching the dimension where suffering ends, you realize that the Buddha's teachings about it were not only true, but also useful. He knew what he was talking about and was able to point you there as well. What's interesting about this simile is the way it combines healthy faith with honest skepticism. To act on this faith is to test it, the way you test a working hypothesis. You need faith to keep following the footprints, but you also need the honesty to recognize where faith ends and knowledge begins. This is why, in the Buddhist context, faith and empiricism are inseparable. Unlike a monotheistic religion, where faith centers on the power of another and skepticism implies a rejection of that power, faith in the Buddha's awakening keeps pointing back to the power of your own actions. Do you have enough power over your intentions to make them harmless? Do harmless intentions then give you the freedom to drop intention entirely? The only way you can answer these questions is by being scrupulously honest about your intentions, to detect even the slightest traces of harm, even the slightest movement of intention itself. Only then will you know the deathless, totally unconditioned by intention for sure. But if you claim to know things that you don't, how can you trust yourself to detect any of these things? You've got to make your inner honesty worthy of the subtle truths you're trying to prove. This is why science will never be able to pass valid judgment on the truths of awakening, for the path deals in matters that outside experimenters can't reach. Although others may sympathize with your suffering, the suffering itself is an experience you can share with no one else. The honesty and skillfulness of your intentions is an affair of your internal dialogue, something that is also purely your own. Scientists can measure the neurological data indicating pain or intentional activity, but there's no external measurement for how the pain feels or how honest your intentional dialogue may be. And as for the deathless, it has no physical correlates at all. The closest that outside empirical measurement can get is to pictures of the footprints on the ground and the marks in the trees. To get to the bull elephant, you have to do what the Buddha's disciple Sariputta did. He kept following the path without jumping to dishonest conclusions, until he saw the elephant within. Then, when the Buddha asked him, "Do you take it on faith that these 5 strengths, faith, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment, lead to the deathless?" Sariputta could answer honestly, "No, I don't take it on faith. I know." As Sariputta stated in another discourse, his proof was experiential but so inward that it touched a dimension where not only the external senses, but even the sense of the functioning of the mind can't reach. If you want to confirm his knowledge, you have to touch that dimension in the only place you can access it, inside yourself. This is one of 2 ways in which the Buddha's method differs from that of modern empiricism. The other has to do with the integrity of the person attempting the proof. As in science, faith in the Buddha's awakening acts like a working hypothesis, but the test of that hypothesis requires an honesty deeper and more radical than anything science requires. You have to commit yourself, every variation on who you feel you are, totally to the test. Only when you take apart all clinging to your inner and outer senses can you prove whether the activity of clinging is what hides the deathless. The Buddha never forced anyone to commit to this test, both because you can't coerce people to be honest with themselves and because he saw that the pit of burning embers was coercion enough. The missing truth. The Buddha says that when we experience pain, stress, suffering, the mind has 2 reactions. One is bewilderment. We don't understand how the suffering has come. The second is a search. Is there anyone out there who knows a way or 2 to put an end to the suffering? This means that we're looking for 3 kinds of truth. We're looking for someone who truly knows the way to put an end to suffering. We're looking for the words that truly describe that way. And then we're looking for the truth itself, an actual experience where there is no suffering. Now, for the most part, we tend to be disappointed. Either there are people who say they know the way, but it turns out they don't, or maybe they don't know how to describe the way if they have found it. So we don't get to the truth of the end of suffering itself. But with the Buddha, we have 1, a person who was true. He truly knows. And 2, as we chant every day, Svakato Bhagavato Dhammo, the Dhamma of the Blessed One is well taught. So his words are true. But simply listening to the words won't take us to the actual true experience of the end of suffering. That's something we have to do. That's where we have to be true in really applying ourselves to the practice. This is why the Buddha said that discernment comes in 3 levels. The first 2 are the discernment that comes from listening and the discernment that comes from thinking things through. We've listened to a lot of Dhamma, we've thought a lot about the Dhamma. What remains is the 3rd level, the discernment that comes from developing. We may have started developing already. I don't think there's anybody sitting here who's brand new to meditation. It's simply a question of how much energy you put into it and how much discernment you bring to it. There are basically 2 things we have to think about. One is committing ourselves to the practice, and the second is reflecting on what we're doing as we practice. The Buddha himself said this is how the Dhamma is found, by committing yourself to the Dhamma and then reflecting on what you're doing. The commitment means that you're going to do this as well as you can, because it's only through doing things as well as you can that you're going to learn where you're still lacking and where you still need improvement. If you just go through the motions, part of you knows that you're not really expecting much in terms of the results. So when the results don't come, you're not surprised. But you haven't really learned anything. This is why the Buddha uses the word commitment. You really give yourself to this. Like right now, you're trying to stay with the breath, to be mindful to stay with the breath. Keep it in mind each time you breathe in, each time you breathe out. If another thought comes in, you remind yourself, no, that's not what we're here for. We're here to work on concentration. Alertness means watching 3 things. The first is the breath, keeping in mind the intention to make sure it's comfortable. That connects with the feeling of ease that you're trying to create here. That gives you 3 of the establishings of mindfulness right there: body, feelings, mind. When you can bring those together, they gain strength from one another. In other words, your intentions are focused on the breath. Your awareness fills the body. The breath fills the body. The sense of ease fills the body. In this way, you give the mind a good place to stay in the present moment. If you have very narrow awareness of the present moment, it's not a very pleasant place to stay. You feel squeezed. You feel constrained. But if you can spread out and fill this territory, it's a spacious place to be. As for the 4th establishing of mindfulness, dogmas, those are basically the qualities of mind you have to bring to bear to protect the other 3. If any of the hindrances show up, sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restlessness and anxiety, uncertainty, you have to get rid of them. Otherwise, they'll eat away at your concentration. As for skillful qualities, those start with the factors for awakening. Mindfulness, your analysis of what's going on in the present moment, your persistence, a sense of rapture, calm, concentration, equanimity. Those are things you try to give rise to when they're not there. When they are there, you try to maintain them. This is how all 4 of the establishings of mindfulness work together. As you develop them, then this really becomes a good place to stay right here. Your mind is more and more inclined to want to be here. It's happy to be here. So try to bring all of these things together. When they're brought together, that's when they grow. It's like a seed. If the seed is in a little plastic bag someplace, and the soil is in another plastic bag someplace else, and they're hidden away in the dark, away from the sun, and away from water, the seed is not going to grow. But if you put them all together, you put the seed in the soil, put the soil in the sun, and then put the water on the seed will grow. It's the same with the body, feelings, and your awareness here. When they come together, they grow. There's a sense that they become one and you wouldn't want to separate them out again. That's concentration. Discernment is when you begin to see that they still are separate things, even though they inhabit the same place. But for the time being, you let that question of discernment be put aside. Right now, you really do want to work on getting things together. When they're not together, it's possible to divide them up in accordance with your preconceived notions, but that's not necessarily where the best places are to divide them. When you've brought them together, though, then the various components eventually will begin to separate out on their own. A Jan Lee's image is of having a rock. You know that there's tin and lead and silver and gold in the rock, but if you try to use a toothpick or a big axe to get the minerals out, they won't come out. You have to heat the rock. The rock sits right there, and then when the melting point for tin comes, the tin will come flowing out on its own. You raise the heat a little bit more until it reaches the melting point for lead. The lead comes flowing out. You raise it until you get to the melting point for silver. The silver comes flowing out. Finally, the same thing with the gold. They separate themselves out on their own through the intensity of your practice. In terms of your mind, intensity means intense mindfulness and intense alertness, as continuous as you can make them, as centered as you can make them. This is where the element of your truth as a person comes in. If you're with the breath for a while, but then wander off someplace else, it's like submitting the rock to some heat, but then taking it out of the heat even before it gets to any of the melting points. It's going to cool down. Then you come back and you heat it up a little bit more. But again, just before it gets to the melting point for tin, you take it out. If you keep on doing this, then no matter how much heat you put in, no matter how much effort you put in, it's not going to get anywhere because it's not continuous. You begin to wonder if there's any tin in the rock at all, to say nothing of silver or gold. It's when you're continually aware, continually alert, continually mindful. That's when the practice develops momentum and gathers strength. It's in this way that your truth as a practitioner makes all the difference. After all, the Buddha's knowledge is already true. The words he used to describe the path to awakening, what the results of that path are going to be, those are already true. And the truth of Nibbana is true in itself. But as long as you aren't true, you're not going to get to that experience of the truth, and you won't really know how true the Buddha is, how true his words are. So that's the missing truth. The truth of your application as you practice. But that's something you can apply and make true. If you couldn't make it true, then there'd be no purpose in the Buddha's teaching to begin with. But it is something you can become more and more truthful about. More truthful in your application, more truthful in your commitment to the practice, reflecting on what you're doing and making adjustments. The reflection is what leads to discernment. The commitment brings more concentration, the two of them acting together, back and forth. That's how all of these truths get brought together, and you get to the truth of the reality of unbinding. That's when you appreciate all the other truths, and where the bewilderment around suffering finally gets totally resolved. Then, as far as the issue of suffering is concerned, as the Buddha said, the mind will have no more questions. Meanwhile, you still have questions, but the way to answer them is not to hope that somebody else will provide you with the answers. Sometimes that may be what you need, but other times, it's simply a matter of your committing yourself to the practice, reflecting on what you're doing, and the truth will appear. The power of truth. One of the Buddha's insights is that truths don't just represent the way things are. In other words, they're not just an act of reporting. They also incite action. They have a power. Certain truths will make you do things, allow you to look at things in a certain way, which will then allow you or compel you to act. This is one of the reasons why the noble truths are noble, because they get you to act in a noble way. The Buddha wasn't interested in simply saying things that were true. As you may remember, his standard for the things he would say was that they be true, beneficial, and timely. The beneficial part had to do not only with the meaning of the words, but also with what they would get you to do. And this is one of the reasons why the two words, Dhamma and Atha, go together so often in the canon. Atha is not only the meaning of the words, but also the goal to which they aim, the profit and benefits they bring about. So, when you ask about the Atha of a teaching, you're asking both about the meaning of the words and about where they lead, what their payoff is. What is this truth for? What good does it do? What does it lead you to do? Truths have power. They do lead in a certain direction. There are lots of true things you can say about reality that can actually be contradictory, or at least they sound contradictory. There are ways you can look at the aggregates and say that they're stressful, and yet the Buddha also admitted that there is pleasure in the aggregates. You can't say they're 100% stress. So, the question is then, which truth are you going to focus on? And that's answered by asking what the result is going to be. What is it going to get you to do? If you focus on how pleasant the aggregates are, you're going to hold on to them. If you focus on their stressful side, then you're going to do what you can so as not to be trapped by them. The noble truths are noble, not only because they get you to do noble things, but also because they get you to a noble attainment. The Buddha talked about two kinds of searches in life. There's the search for happiness in things that will change. He said that there's nothing noble about that. And then there's the search for happiness in things that don't change. No aging, no illness, no death. That kind of search, he said, is noble. To help with that search, we look at things in terms of the four noble truths. There are certain duties that go along with them, and when we fulfill those duties, they'll take us to something deathless. That experience of the deathless is what guarantees that they really are true and really are noble. We might look at the truths, think about them, and decide that, yes, they seem reasonable. But as the Buddha said, Just because something is reasonable doesn't mean that it really is true. The fact that they're reasonable simply aids in giving us confidence or conviction in their truth. That's one of his observations that go against our understanding in the West, that things like conviction or faith are opposed to reason. We have that belief because there's a major religion in our society that extols things you have to take on faith, even though they go contrary to reason. That's why we think that reason and faith are two radically different things. But as the Buddha said, just because the Four Noble Truths seem reasonable, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're true. There has to be a further test. Their reasonableness is what gives you the faith and conviction that they're worth the test. If something doesn't make sense, if it contradicts itself, it doesn't really invite you to test whether it's true. But if something seems reasonable, it seems worthy of the test. So you put it to the test, and you put yourself to the test too, because these truths demand a lot of you. They demand that you look at your thoughts, your words, and your deeds, and particularly your thoughts, in a way that often will require you to let go of things you really like. That's because you learn how to look at the thoughts as part of a causal process. When you think in this particular way, where does it lead? When you think in a different way, where does it lead? This is what's special about the Noble Truths. They focus on this process of what the mind is doing with the truth. In this way, they contain the seeds for their own transcendence. There's a passage where Anathapindika is talking to a group of wanderers. He wanted to see the Buddha, but it was too early in the morning. The Buddha and the monks were out on their alms rounds, so he goes to talk to some wanderers instead. They ask him first off, what does the Buddha believe? What are his views? And it's interesting. Here's Anathapindika, who's a stream enterer by that time. He's already seen the deathless, and yet he says, I don't really know the extent of the Buddha's views. Remembering, of course, that what the Buddha taught was just a handful of leaves, as opposed to the leaves of the forest, which were all the various types of knowledge he got in his awakening. So the wanderers ask him, in that case, what do you believe? What are your views? And he replies, I'll be happy to tell you my views, but first you tell me yours. And so the different groups have their different positions. Some say that the world is eternal. Some say it's not eternal. Some say it's finite. Some say it's infinite. The body is the same thing as the soul. The body is different from the soul. After the death of a Tathagata, you can say either that he exists or he doesn't exist, or both or neither. The standard list of positions on the hot philosophical issues of the day. As Anathapindika then points out, each particular view is stressful, it's inconstant, it's put together, and everything that's inconstant and put together is going to lead to stress if you hold on to it. So as you cling to that view, you cling to stress. After that, they say, okay, what's your view? And so he says, whatever is inconstant and put together is stressful. Whatever is stressful is not me, not myself, not what I am. They say, well, you're holding on to that. You're clinging to that. So you're going to suffer from that too. He says, no, following this view, I see the escape from it. That's because it focuses you back on the process of how you relate to truths and how you relate to your views, so it enables you to let go of it when you no longer need it, when it leads to nothing but stress. And in the letting go, that's when it leads to the deathless. So these are special views, and they're special because of their power. They lead you to a certain kind of action. They lead you to look at your own mind carefully. What are you doing? How do you relate to your thoughts, words, and deeds? How do you relate to your beliefs? How do you relate to your practices and all the things that we tend to cling to? What are the results of that clinging? How can you learn how not to cling to them? We need certain views, and we need certain habits and practices, and even certain assumptions about ourselves in order to practice. But how do you use these things so they don't just keep you trapped? When they've done their work, how can you learn to let go? In the beginning, you learn not to pride yourself on your views or your habits. You don't brag about them, and you don't get into needless arguments with people about them, because when you get into arguments, there's always the question of who wins the arguments, and that leads to a certain amount of pride, and that pride will cause a problem. You get into arguments only when you see that there's a chance to correct a view that causes harm to the person holding it. So, avoiding needless arguments is, on the beginning level, how you begin to use these parts of the practice without being tied down to them and without using them to create needless trouble for yourself. Remember the image of the snake. As the Buddha said, you try to grasp a snake, and if you grasp it wrongly, in other words, you grasp it by the tail, it's going to bite you. If you grasp it rightly, then it's not going to cause any trouble. You take a forked stick and you pin it down right behind its head. And no matter how much it may writhe around the stick, or even around your arm, it can't do you any harm. But notice, in both cases, you're holding the snake, but in one case, you're holding it in a way that doesn't cause you any harm. The views are things that you have to hold on to, but you need to learn how to hold on to them properly. You hold to these truths in a proper way because they lead you to something beyond them, if you're holding them properly. Some people would say, why not just avoid having any views at all? Well, that would be like not holding the snake at all. And if you don't hold the snake, how are you going to get the advantage that you can get from snakes? If you can get their venom, you can use it to create anti-venom. If you don't hold on to the snake at all, you're not going to get any benefit from it. So you do have to hold on. It's simply a question of how you hold on. You have to remember that you're holding on for the purpose of getting past suffering. That's what the Four Noble Truths all keep pointing to, simply laying things out. There's suffering, and there is its cause. There's a cessation of suffering, and there is a path to its cessation. The cessation is obviously where you want to go. In that way, the truths give you a goal. They give you an atha, a purpose, and they get you to act toward that purpose. That's their atha too. That's the power of these truths. Then they reveal their power in being genuinely true and noble when they lead to a real experience of the deathless. When that comes, you naturally put them aside because you realize that talking about the deathless or having views about the deathless is one thing, but actually experiencing it is something else. The experience is what you're going for, and the experience is such that you don't need the words to stay with it. It stays on its own. So when you consider the various truths in the world, you'll notice that some have a lot of power and some have very little power. Certain facts you can learn and they don't have any impact on your behavior. Those are things that are true but not necessarily beneficial. Then there are certain truths that, if you act on them, are going to actually cause trouble. Those are not truths you want to get involved with in any way at all. What you want are truths that are true and beneficial and right for you at this time. And the noble truths, as the Buddha said, are categorically true. In other words, they are always true. They always apply to every situation. So learn how to apply them in the right way so that they can really reveal their power, the power that makes them noble.